Please don't send her away." The little boy's voice cracked so badly that even the servants standing outside the study lowered their eyes in shock, because in the 7 years Lord Oliver Ashcombe had lived inside Blackthorn Hall, the young heir had never once begged his father for anything. Not when his mother died. Not when he was left alone for weeks while the Duke traveled. Not even when nightmares woke him crying in the middle of winter. But now his tiny hands clutched the sleeve of one of the most feared noblemen in England, and tears streamed down his pale face as he stood between the Duke and the young woman quietly packing her belongings near the door. The Duke of Blackthorn said nothing at first. He simply stared at his son as though the child had suddenly begun speaking a language he did not understand. And perhaps he had. Because Oliver was asking for love, and love was the one thing the Duke had spent his entire life teaching himself to live without. Years later, people across England would whisper about the powerful Duke who shocked high society by marrying a governess barely older than himself. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew it had begun with a frightened little boy standing in a study one rainy afternoon, trying to save the only person who had ever made Blackthorn Hall feel like a home again. Before Clara Whitmore arrived, the estate had been a monument to silence. The halls were enormous, immaculate, and cold in the particular way only old aristocratic houses could be, where every portrait seemed to watch quietly and every footstep echoed too long. After the death of the Duchess 5 years earlier, the Duke had transformed into a man people respected deeply and understood not at all. He was still young, not yet 30, but grief had sharpened him into something distant and severe. Servants feared disappointing him. Guests carefully measured every word around him. Even his own son treated him less like a father and more like a king whose moods determined the weather of the entire household. Yet no one could accuse the Duke of cruelty. He provided everything money could buy. Oliver had the finest tutors, the finest clothes, the finest future any child could inherit. But affection was not something the Duke of Blackthorn knew how to give naturally anymore. Somewhere after burying his wife, he had mistaken emotional restraint for strength, and over time the entire house learned to survive around the emptiness he carried. Oliver learned fastest of all. By 7 years old, the boy had already mastered silence with heartbreaking precision. He never interrupted adults, never cried in public, never asked for toys or sweets or extra time with his father. If a tutor scolded him unfairly, he apologized anyway. If he fell and hurt himself, he stood before tears could fully form. The servants adored him because he was so gentle, but many secretly pitied him too, because no child should have understood loneliness so well. Then, during one especially brutal winter, Clara Whitmore arrived at Blackthorn Hall. Officially, she had been hired as a temporary educational companion to assist with Oliver's studies and social development. Unofficially, she was the desperate recommendation of an elderly physician who had quietly warned the Duke that his son was becoming emotionally withdrawn. The Duke had resisted the idea immediately. He disliked strangers inside his household, particularly young women clever enough to attract gossip, but the physician had insisted, and eventually the Duke agreed to a 3-month arrangement. Clara arrived carrying only 2 small cases and wearing a coat far too thin for the weather. She was 24 years old, composed without being stiff, and possessed the unusual habit of speaking to servants and noblemen in exactly the same calm tone. The first thing she did upon entering Blackthorn Hall was kneel to Oliver's eye level instead of addressing him like a miniature adult. "Hello, Lord Oliver," she said gently. "I've heard you dislike arithmetic." The little boy blinked in shock. "I dislike fractions," he corrected quietly. Clara smiled as though this distinction mattered deeply. An entirely reasonable position. That was the first time anyone had heard Oliver laugh in months. The change afterward happened slowly enough that the Duke almost missed it. At first it was little things. Oliver lingering longer at breakfast. Books abandoned in favor of exploring gardens. Occasional laughter drifting through hallways that had previously sounded like churches. Clara never pushed the child for affection or conversation. Somehow that made him trust her more. She listened carefully when he spoke, answered his endless questions seriously, taught him constellations from the library balcony at night. And most importantly, she never treated his sadness like an inconvenience to be corrected. The Duke noticed all of this despite himself. Often he would pause outside rooms without entering, hearing Clara and Oliver talking quietly inside. Sometimes she read adventure stories aloud while Oliver rested beside the fire. Other times she helped him replant winter flowers in the greenhouse because the boy had once admitted he worried the estate looked too asleep. The Duke told himself he merely appreciated her effectiveness. Nothing more. But then came the evening that unsettled him completely. He had returned unexpectedly early from a meeting in London and entered the library to find Oliver asleep against Clara's shoulder while she sat motionless beneath candlelight, carefully holding the book open with one hand so she would not wake him. For reasons he could not explain, the sight stopped him cold. The room looked warm, alive, human, things Blackthorn Hall had not felt in years. Clara glanced up at him quietly. "I tried to wake him for supper," she whispered apologetically. "He insisted he wasn't tired." And then, she smiled softly toward the sleeping boy. The Duke could not answer immediately, because for one dangerous moment, standing there watching them together, he felt something he had forbidden himself from wanting ever again. Not desire alone. Home. And that frightened him far more than loneliness ever had. The gossip began shortly afterward. Young servants whispered. Visiting relatives observed too much warmth between the governess and the household. Society had rules for men like the Duke of Blackthorn, and none of those rules allowed emotional attachment to women beneath his station. At first he ignored the rumors. Then one evening an old family acquaintance casually suggested Clara was becoming far too comfortable at Blackthorn Hall. Something dark twisted inside him at the comment, not because it offended propriety, but because it exposed how protective he had already become of her. That night he made the decision he would soon regret more than any other. Clara Whitmore would leave Blackthorn Hall before spring ended, and the next morning, completely unaware he was about to shatter the heart of the one person who loved him most, the Duke of Blackthorn summoned her to his study, while a small boy unknowingly listened from the hallway outside the door. "Please don't send her away." Oliver's voice was so small it should not have carried across the study, yet somehow it silenced the entire room more completely than a shout ever could. Clara froze beside the desk, one gloved hand still resting on the handle of the leather case she had begun packing only an hour earlier, while the Duke of Blackthorn stared at his son as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The rain outside battered the tall windows in steady gray sheets, and somewhere deeper inside the estate a clock chimed softly, but no one moved. Because the impossible had just happened. Lord Oliver Ashcombe, the quiet heir who never complained, never protested, never asked his father for comfort or kindness or time, was begging. Tears rolled unchecked down the little boy's face as he tightened his grip on the Duke's sleeve. "I'll do better," he whispered desperately, his voice trembling harder with every word. "I promise I will. Please, please don't make her go." Clara covered her mouth instantly, horrified by the child's panic, but the Duke could not speak. He looked down at his son and saw, perhaps for the very first time, not a future title or a responsibility to shape, but a frightened little boy trying with all his strength not to lose the only person who had made him feel safe since his mother died. The realization struck with such force that it left the Duke momentarily defenseless against it. For years he had convinced himself that distance protected people, that restraint was wisdom, that withholding affection somehow lessened future grief. Yet now his son stood before him shaking with fear precisely because he had spent years teaching the child that love was temporary. The Duke slowly loosened Oliver's fingers from his coat, though not harshly. "Oliver," he said carefully, his voice lower than usual, "this is not your fault." But the child looked unconvinced. "Then why does she have to leave?" The question landed like a blade because the Duke himself no longer knew how to answer honestly. He could hardly explain society's cruelty to a 7-year-old boy. Could hardly admit that the sight of Clara in his home had begun affecting him in ways he no longer trusted himself to control. Could hardly confess that every time she smiled at him across the dinner table, some buried part of him remembered what happiness had once felt like before grief turned him into a stranger inside his own life. Clara finally stepped forward quietly. "Oliver," she said softly, kneeling before him, "your father is only doing what he believes is best." The boy shook his head immediately. "No, he isn't." The words were not angry. That somehow made them worse. Simple honesty from a child too young to disguise heartbreak. Clara looked stunned into silence, and even the Duke flinched slightly as though struck. Oliver wiped furiously at his tears with the sleeve of his sweater, embarrassed by his own crying now that both adults were watching him. "Everyone leaves," he whispered. "Mama left. Tutors leave. Everyone always leaves." Clara's eyes filled instantly. But it was the Duke who felt something inside him begin to fracture. Because the boy had spoken those words with the certainty of experience. Not fear. Acceptance. Somewhere over the last 5 years, Oliver had stopped believing people stayed. And the Duke suddenly realized he himself had taught him that lesson. The child had inherited enormous wealth, ancient titles, and one of the grandest estates in England. Yet emotionally, he behaved like someone preparing constantly for abandonment. Clara gently took Oliver's trembling hands. "Listen to me," she said carefully. "None of this means you are unloved." The little boy gave a tiny, broken laugh at that, the kind children make when they already know adults are trying to soften painful truths. "Then why does it hurt so much?" Neither adult answered immediately because neither possessed a lie convincing enough. The storm outside deepened as silence filled the study again. Finally, Clara stood slowly and turned toward the Duke with quiet dignity. "Your Grace," she said softly. "Perhaps I should leave sooner. This is clearly becoming harder for him." The Duke looked at her sharply, almost angrily, though not at her suggestion itself. Angry because some part of him realized she was once again sacrificing her own feelings to protect everyone else. Even now, standing heartbroken beside packed luggage, Clara's first instinct was still to make things easier for others. Oliver panicked instantly. "No." He grabbed Clara's hand desperately before she could step away. "Please don't go tonight." Clara knelt again immediately, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers while the child fought unsuccessfully to stop crying. And suddenly the Duke understood something that terrified him more than gossip ever could. Oliver loved her, not with childish dependency alone, but with the fierce devotion lonely children develop toward the first person who truly sees them. If Clara disappeared now, the boy would survive it, of course. Children survived many things, but something fragile and precious inside him might close forever afterward. The Duke knew because the same thing had once happened to him. He turned away briefly toward the windows, jaw tight with conflict. Every instinct forged by aristocratic duty demanded he continue as planned. Clara remaining at Blackthorn Hall would invite scrutiny. Rumors had already begun. Marriage-minded noble families were watching carefully. A duke did not entangle himself emotionally with a governess, especially one close to his own age. Yet standing there listening to his son quietly sob against Clara's shoulder, those expectations suddenly felt hollow compared to the damage he was causing inside his own home. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded exhausted. "Oliver," he said slowly, "go upstairs for now." The boy stiffened immediately. No, it was the first direct refusal the Duke had ever received from his son. Under any other circumstance, such defiance would have earned immediate correction. Instead, the Duke simply stared at him with weary disbelief. Clara looked equally shocked. "Oliver," she whispered gently, "you mustn't speak to your father that way." But the little boy only looked up at the Duke with red-rimmed eyes and heartbreaking determination. "If I leave," he said shakily, "you'll make her go while I'm gone." The accusation hit too close to truth. For a long moment the Duke said nothing at all. Then, very quietly, he asked, "Do you truly care for her so much?" Oliver answered instantly, "She stays when I'm scared." The simplicity of the response nearly destroyed him. Not because it was dramatic, because it revealed how little the child required to love someone completely. Presence, patience, kindness. Things the Duke had once assumed were insignificant compared to providing wealth and protection. Yet Clara had given Oliver more comfort in a few months than privilege had provided in years. The Duke looked toward her then, and what unsettled him most was the realization that she was crying silently too, though trying desperately to hide it from the boy. She loved Oliver as well, deeply, unselfishly, and perhaps that was why the next words felt inevitable even before he fully decided to say them. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said quietly, "unpack your cases." Clara stared at him in stunned confusion. Oliver stopped breathing entirely. The Duke swallowed once before forcing himself to continue. "You may remain at Blackthorn Hall." For one suspended second nobody moved. Then Oliver burst forward so quickly he merely collided with the desk, throwing his arms around Clara while laughing and crying at once. The sound echoed through the study like sunlight breaking through years of winter silence. And as the Duke watched his son cling to the young woman who had somehow brought life back into their empty home, he realized with growing unease that keeping Clara at Blackthorn Hall might prove far more dangerous to his heart than sending her away ever would have been. By the end of summer, the entire county was talking about the Duke of Blackthorn and the beautiful young governess who had somehow become impossible to separate from his household. The rumors spread through ballrooms, garden parties, and aristocratic dinners with the speed of wildfire because people preferred scandal to truth, and the truth was far too simple for society to believe. Clara Whitmore had not enchanted the Duke with manipulation or ambition. She had done something far more extraordinary. She had loved his son openly in a house that had nearly forgotten how love sounded. But gossip has a way of poisoning even the quietest happiness, and as autumn approached, the pressure around Blackthorn Hall became impossible to ignore. Invitations arrived from influential families eager to introduce the Duke to eligible noblewomen. Elderly relatives began making pointed remarks about appearances, legacy, and appropriate attachments. One countess laughed openly during a dinner party and asked whether the Duke planned to educate the governess forever or merely until he tired of her company. The entire table went silent afterward because the Duke's expression turned so cold, even seasoned politicians shifted nervously in their seats. Yet despite his anger, the whispers accomplished exactly what they were intended to accomplish. They forced him to confront the truth he had spent months avoiding. Clara could not remain in this strange, undefined place forever. Not as merely an employee, not while Oliver loved her like family, not while the Duke himself had begun rearranging entire days around the sound of her voice. He noticed everything now. The way she tucked loose hair behind her ear while reading. The way she smiled at servants others ignored. The way she unconsciously reached for Oliver's hand whenever they crossed busy streets in town. And most dangerous of all was the fact that Blackthorn Hall no longer felt empty when she was near. The Duke had once believed grief permanently closed certain doors inside people. Clara made him wonder if some doors waited quietly for years hoping someone gentle enough would eventually reopen them. Unfortunately, Oliver noticed the growing tension too. Children always did. Though only 7, he had become startlingly sensitive to shifts in mood, particularly his father's. So when the Duke began withdrawing into work again, spending longer hours locked inside his study after receiving several particularly vicious letters from relatives, Oliver immediately assumed the worst. The fear returned slowly at first. He became quieter during meals, more clingy toward Clara. Occasionally the Duke would catch the child watching him with nervous uncertainty, as though waiting for another goodbye to arrive without warning. Then came the night everything finally unraveled. A grand charity gala hosted at Blackthorn Hall brought nearly half the county's aristocracy into the estate, and from the beginning the evening felt wrong. Clara had intended to remain upstairs entirely to avoid gossip, but Oliver begged her to help him prepare for the event because he hated formal gatherings and only felt calm when she was nearby. Reluctantly, she agreed. Unfortunately, several guests noticed. By the middle of the evening, whispers followed Clara openly through the ballroom. Women stared too long. Men smirked carelessly. One particularly cruel noblewoman remarked loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The Duke seems remarkably devoted to his staff. Clara's face paled instantly, but before she could retreat gracefully, Oliver appeared beside her holding her hand protectively. She's not staff, the little boy snapped with surprising anger. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. The noblewoman gave a patronizing smile. Of course, darling. Oliver looked ready to cry from frustration, but before he could speak again, the Duke of Blackthorn crossed the ballroom toward them with terrifying calm. Conversations died immediately as guests stepped aside. The Duke stopped directly, in front of the noblewoman who had insulted Clara. "You will apologize," he said quietly. She blinked in shock. "Your Grace, I meant no offense, and yet you caused it." The silence surrounding them became suffocating. No one had ever seen the Duke publicly defend someone this way before, especially not against members of his own social circle. The woman finally muttered an apology and retreated quickly, but the damage had already been done. Oliver clung harder to Clara's hand, while she stood visibly shaken beneath dozens of watching eyes. The Duke looked between them and suddenly understood something with devastating clarity. Society would never stop. Not unless he gave the world an answer powerful enough to silence every whisper permanently. Later that night, after the final guest departed and Blackthorn Hall settled into exhausted quiet, the Duke found Clara alone in the greenhouse Oliver loved so much. Rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling while lantern light flickered across rows of autumn roses. Clara stood near the window with her back turned when he entered. "I'm sorry," she whispered before he could speak. "Tonight caused embarrassment for you." The Duke stared at her in disbelief. Even after being humiliated publicly, her first concern remained protecting him. "Clara," he said softly, "look at me." She hesitated before turning slowly. Her eyes were red from crying. Something inside him finally gave way completely at the sight. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "None of this is your fault." Clara tried to smile faintly. "Your world would be easier without me in it." The word struck him like physical pain because for months he had tried convincing himself the exact same thing. Yet standing there now, imagining Blackthorn Hall without her laughter, without Oliver running happily through gardens beside her, without warmth-filling rooms that once felt frozen in grief, the idea seemed unbearable. "No," he said quietly. "It wouldn't." Clara looked stunned by the certainty in his voice. The Duke stepped closer slowly, every instinct warning him there was no returning after this moment. "Do you know why Oliver begged me not to send you away?" he asked softly. Her eyes filled immediately. "Because he loves you," the Duke continued before she could answer. "And because somewhere along the way, so did I." Clara's breath caught sharply. For several seconds neither moved at all. Then the Duke did something even he would once have considered impossible. He reached for her hand. "I spent years believing love only made loss inevitable," he admitted quietly. "But losing you would be the greatest mistake of my life." Tears slid silently down Clara's cheeks. "You don't have to say this because of tonight. I'm saying it because every day without you has begun feeling unimaginable." At that exact moment, a tiny sleepy voice appeared behind them. "I knew it." Both turned sharply to find Oliver standing barefoot in the greenhouse doorway, clutching a blanket around his shoulders. The little boy looked entirely too pleased with himself for someone awake past midnight. Clara laughed through tears while the Duke stared at his son in astonishment. "You were supposed to be asleep," he said. Oliver grinned. "I tried, but I wanted to make sure nobody was leaving." The Duke crossed the room immediately and lifted the child into his arms, something he realized with shame he should have done far more often throughout Oliver's life. The boy wrapped small arms tightly around his father's neck before looking between both adults hopefully. "So she's staying forever now?" For the first time in many years, the Duke of Blackthorn smiled without restraint. "Yes," he said softly, pulling Clara close beside them. "Forever." And years later, long after society stopped gossiping and long after Clara became the Duchess of Blackthorn, servants would still quietly tell the story of the little boy who changed an entire family simply because he found the courage to ask his father for the one thing all of them secretly needed most.